Good day, Urdaneta City National High School Grade 12 students. This is Sir Bill Ramos, your teacher for today. Welcome to another fun and exciting topic on genetics entitled Phenotype and Genotype. At the end of this lesson, you are expected to define what is phenotype and genotype, determine the phenotype and genotype of offsprings as well as the genotypic and phenotypic ratio, and calculate the probability of occurrences of traits in a given cross. Before we start our lesson, will you answer the following questions? The first question is, very good. The answer is alleles. Our next question is, that's right. The answer is dominant traits. Our third question is, again, that's correct. The answer is recessive traits. And our last question is, you got it right. The answer is homozygous and heterozygous traits. It seems like you are now ready for our next lesson. Have you ever wondered why parents with both black eyes had a child with blue eyes? In this lesson, we will understand why those cases occur. Are you ready? Let's start. Before we proceed to our discussion, let's have first our preliminary activity. Just study the jumbled letters and try to rearrange the letters to form a word being defined in the following items. 1. It is an organism's complete set of genetic material. That is genotype. Very good. 2. The set of observable characteristics of an individual resulting from the interaction of sets of genotypes within the environment. Very good. That is phenotype. 3. Is a specific characteristic of an organism, and this can be determined by genes or environment, or more commonly by the interactions between them. You are right, that is trait. Number 4, a measure of the likelihood of a statement or a theoretical expectation is correct. The likelihood of an event to occur. Very good. Probability. Number 5, the quantitative relation between two amounts showing the number of times one value contains is contained within the other. That is a ratio. You got it right. Now, we are ready to listen with our discussion. Lend me your ears and focus as we watch this video.
Now, before we get into Punnett squares and how to solve problems using them, let's talk about a few things that you need to know. You need to be familiar with alleles, different flavors of genes. And there's two types of alleles typically for one trait. You have the dominant allele, which will be represented by a capital letter, such as capital B for brown eyes. Or you have a recessive allele, which will be the lowercase letter. In this case, it could represent blue eyes. Now, the traits can vary. It could be eye color, it could be hair, it could be if you're tall or short. It can vary. Now, you need to be familiar with these terms as well. The first one, homozygous dominant. So what does that mean? Well, think of the word homo. Homo means the same. So A person with a homozygous dominant trait would have two capital letters or two capital dominant alleles. In this case, B and B. Someone who's heterozygous has a dominant and a recessive allele. Hetero means different. Homozygous recessive, they have the same recessive allele. In this case, two lowercase letters. So this information here is referred to as the genotype for that particular trait because it tells you the genes that corresponds to a certain trait. Now the phenotype is associated with the physical characteristics that relate to those traits. Now the individual with the homozygous dominant trait, he's going to have brown eyes because big B is associated with brown eyes. The person with the homozygous recessive trait is going to have blue eyes. So this represents the phenotype of the individual, the physical characteristics that you can visibly see. Now what about the heterozygous individual, where he has both the dominant and the recessive allele? What physical characteristic will he display, or she? What will be that individual's phenotype? So what would you say? Which one is going to win, the dominant allele or the recessive allele? Whenever you have an individual with a heterozygous trait, the dominant allele is going to win the battle. So this person is going to have brown eyes. Let's start with this one. A homozygous wolf with blue eyes mates with a heterozygous wolf with brown eyes. What is the probability that they will produce a wolf with blue eyes? So let's begin by drawing a monohybrid cross. So this is a Punnett square that only focuses on one characteristic, one trait, in this case, eye color. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw one square, and then we're going to draw a vertical line and a horizontal line. So now we have a total of 4 squares. Now, what is the genotype of the homozygous wolf? So homozygous means that he has, or it has, both the same genes, either lowercase b or capital B, but they have to be the same. Now, we're dealing with blue eyes and brown eyes. Typically, blue eyes is usually the recessive trait, and brown eyes is usually the dominant trait. So here we have a homozygous wolf with blue eyes. So therefore, that wolf has the genotype lowercase b, which I'm going to put here. Now the second wolf is a heterozygous wolf with brown eyes. So based on that information, what is the genotype of that wolf? So it's heterozygous, which means that it's going to have 2 different alleles, one capital, one lowercase, and it's still going to have brown eyes, since capital B is the dominant allele. So now all we need to do is basically fill in the Punnett square. So in this square, we're going to write these 2 letters, and we're going to put the capital letter first. So it's going to be capital B and then lowercase b. And the same is true for this one. And for this particular square, it intersects these 2 letters. So it's going to be lowercase b, and for the last one, it will be the same. So once we fill out the Punnett square, now we can answer the question. So what is the probability that they will produce a wolf with blue eyes? So this represents the genotype of a wolf with blue eyes, and these genotypes represent a wolf with brown eyes. So to calculate the probability, you look at how many have been chosen. In this case, there's 2 with blue eyes out of a total of 4. So 2 out of 4, that's 1/2, which is 50%. If you divide this, you'll get 0.5 in your calculator and then multiply that by 100. That will give you 50%. So that is the probability that they will produce a wolf with blue eyes. Now, what about part B? Calculate the phenotype ratio and the genotype ratio. So let's make some space. Let's start with the phenotype ratio. So we're dealing with the colors of the eyes, the physical characteristics. And there's only two colors to deal with. Either the baby wolves have blue eyes or they have brown eyes. So out of, let's say, 4 baby wolves, 2 of them will have blue eyes and 2 will have brown eyes, which I use the color red instead of brown for some reason. And so you could divide both numbers by 2 and thus you get the simplified ratio. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So that's the phenotype ratio. Blue to brown, or if you want to do brown to blue, it's still going to be 1-to-1. Now let's talk about the genotype ratio. And there's only 2 genotypes. So it's either big B and little b, which we see here, or little b and little b. So it's still 2-to-2, which can be reduced to a ratio of 1-to-1. So that's the genotype ratio for the first generation. Now let's work on another example. 2 heterozygous cats with brown eyes mate together. What is the probability that they will produce a cat with brown eyes? So once again, we're going to say capital B is associated with brown eyes and little b is going to be associated with blue eyes. So based on this information, calculate the probability that the baby cat is going to have brown eyes. So let's begin by drawing a Punnett square. Now the fact that both parents are heterozygous means that their genotype is big B, little b. So we can write that here. So in this spot, that's going to be the intersection of big B and big B. Here we're going to have big B, little b, same over here. And for the last one, that's going to be the intersection of 2 lowercase b's. So now we could focus on answering the question. What is the probability that they will produce a cat with brown eyes? So which cats will have brown eyes? So this one will be brown, and the same is true for these 2. And this particular cat will be blue. So out of 4 cats, 3 of them will have brown eyes. So the probability will be the 3 cats with brown eyes out of a total of 4. 3 divided by 4 is 0.75. If you multiply that by 100, you're going to get 75%. So that is the probability that they will produce a cat with brown eyes. Now part B, what is the probability that the baby cat will be homozygous? So out of all the traits listed here, which one is homozygous? So homozygous means that they have the same letters. In this case, it's big B and big B, that's homozygous, or little b with little b. So for part B, there's going to be 2 cats out of a total of 4 with a homozygous trait, or a homozygous genotype. So that's 50%. Now let's talk about calculating the phenotype and the genotype ratio in part C. So let's start with the phenotype ratio. So once again, we only have 2 colors, 2 eye colors, so that's brown and blue. And we have 3 genotypes that correspond to the color brown, and only 1 that corresponds to the color blue. So it's going to be 3 to 1. So that's the phenotypic ratio. Now let's calculate the genotypic ratio. So first, let's list the different types, the different genotypes that we see. So this is 1, big B and big B. These two are the same, capital B and lowercase b. And this one is the last one remaining. So we only have one homozygous dominant genotype, and we have two heterozygous genotypes, and one homozygous recessive genotype. So the genotypic ratio is 1 to 1.
After watching the video, let's have some exercises. Determine the phenotype and genotype of offsprings. Determine its genotypic and phenotypic ratio, and the probability of occurrence of traits in a given cross. Number 1. Homozygous tall cat mated heterozygous tall cat. Now, give the phenotypic and genotypic ratio, the probability, and the phenotype and genotype of offsprings. Let's check your work. The offsprings are 2 homozygous tall and 2 heterozygous tall. The phenotypic ratio is 2:2 or 1:1. Genotypic ratio 2:2 or 1:1. And the probability of the offsprings homozygous tall 50% and the heterozygous tall is also 50%. Next, number 2, Gino has homozygous black eyes, which is dominant, marries Hannah with homozygous brown eyes, which is recessive. Now, determine the offsprings, its phenotype and genotype, the phenotypic ratio, the genotypic ratio, and the probability of occurrence of traits in a given cross. Now, let's check your answer. Offsprings, we have 4 heterozygous black eyes with genotype uppercase B and lowercase b. Phenotypic ratio 1:0 or 1. Genotypic ratio 1:0 or 1. And the probability of the occurrence of traits in the offsprings is 100% in heterozygous black eyes. Now, let's have the last problem. Mrs. Reyes has heterozygous fair complexion, which is dominant, while Mr. Reyes has homozygous white complexion, which is recessive. Now, determine their offsprings, the genotype and phenotype, the phenotypic ratio, the genotypic ratio, and the probability of occurrence of traits in a given cross. Let's check your work. offsprings, we have two homozygous white complexion, lowercase f and lowercase f, and two heterozygous fair complexion, lowercase f and uppercase f. 2. The phenotypic ratio is 2 is to 2 or 1 is to 1. Genotypic ratio, 2 is to 2 or 1 is to 1. The probability, the homozygous white complexion is 50% and the heterozygous fair complexion is 50%. And now, do you understand our lesson? If yes, get your pen and your paper and let us assess your learnings through determining the phenotype and genotype of offsprings, as well as the phenotypic and genotypic ratio, and of course, let's calculate the probability of occurrences of traits in a given cross. I will give you 1 minute to answer each question. And now, let's have our evaluation. Number 1, in cats, long hair is recessive to short hair. A true breeding homozygous short-haired male is mated to a long-haired female. What their kittens look like? Determine the phenotypic and genotypic ratio and the probability of traits in the offsprings. Your timer starts now. Time's up. Let's check your answer. Let's check your answer. 1. 4 heterozygous short-haired kittens are their offsprings. Uppercase H and lowercase h. 2. The phenotypic ratio is 1 is to 0 or 1. The genotypic ratio is also 1 is to 0 or 1. 4. The probability of the occurrence of traits in their offsprings, we have 4 heterozygous short-haired kittens, that is 100%. Now number 2, Mr. and Mrs. Jones have 4 children. Mrs. Jones has attached earlobes, which is homozygous recessive, while Mr. Jones has free earlobes, heterozygous dominant. Now, determine the phenotypic and genotypic ratio and the probability of traits in the offsprings. Your timer starts now. Time's up. Let's check your answer. The phenotypic ratio is 2:2 or 1:1. Genotypic ratio also 2:2 or 1:1. And the probability of occurrence of traits in the offsprings, we have heterozygous free earlobes 50% and homozygous attached earlobes 50%. Congratulations, you did a great job. And now you already understood that even siblings can have different skin color, eye color, and even height. That is explained by genetics and interpreted by phenotype and genotype. I hope you have great time discovering new ideas through our lesson. Remember what John Maynard Smith says, that genetics is how information are stored and transmitted between generations. This is Sir Bill Ramos. Good day.